The question still hangs in the humid night air, heavy and sweet like overripe fruit. What do women taste like? It wasn't a joke thrown out after too many drinks. It was a plea, whispered in the dark. We live in a world of manicured lawns and high cedar fences, a place designed to keep secrets in and chaos out. My neighbor Mara was the queen of that world, poised, perfect, and seemingly untouchable. But proximity is a dangerous thing. It erodes defenses slowly until one look changes the physics of the entire neighborhood. The moment she caught my eye that night, the air charged with an undeniable pull. Our houses are separated by a sliver of aggressive green turf and a fence that offers the illusion of privacy, not the reality. It creates a false sense of safety, this architecture of distance. From my home office window, I have a front row seat to the performance of her life. I work in high-stakes crisis management. Precision is my currency. So I know how to read the fault lines in a structure long before it collapses. And Mara was a structure vibrating with invisible stress. She moved through her garden with a frantic sort of elegance, always dressed in linen that refused to wrinkle, hair pinned back with severe perfection. To the rest of the cul-de-sac, she was the enviable wife of a successful architect, content among her hydrangeas. But I watched her when the audience was gone. I saw the way she stood motionless by the pool for 20 minutes, staring at the water like she wanted to drown in it. I saw the way she twisted her diamond ring until the skin turned red, a nervous tic that betrayed the calm facade. We played the role of polite neighbors perfectly. I was the single, career-focused woman next door. Safe, perhaps a bit of a curiosity, but ultimately benign. She was the gracious hostess. We exchanged pleasantries over the fence line about the weather or the homeowners association. The heat is terrible this year, she would say, her smile tight. Unbearable, I'd agree, keeping my gaze steady, professional. But the air between our properties was never just air. It carried the scent of her expensive floral perfume, drifting into my yard like a challenge. It carried the sound of her voice, sharp with her husband, then softening instantly when she sensed me nearby. There is an intoxication in that kind of proximity. You start to memorize the rhythm of a stranger's life. I knew her schedule better than I knew my own mother's. I knew the specific click of her back door sliding shut at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. I won't lie and say I wasn't looking. I've always had a weakness for women who are trying too hard to hold it together. There is a specific, dangerous beauty in that tension, like a violin string wound to the breaking point. But I kept my distance. I am a woman who understands boundaries. I build my life on them. I keep my history with women quiet in this zip code because I don't need the messy complications of a bored suburban wife experimenting with her identity. I watched her restlessness with a detached, clinical fascination, refusing to acknowledge the way my pulse jumped when she lingered at the fence a second too long. It started with small breaches in the protocol. She began finding reasons to be outside when I took my coffee breaks. She'd ask for advice on things she clearly understood, lawn care, paint colors, just to keep the conversation running. Her eyes would trace the line of my throat, then dart away, terrified. I remained unflinching, offering steady, neutral answers, refusing to give her the reaction she didn't know she was begging for. There's a charge to being the object of a straight woman's suppressed curiosity. It's a heavy, humid weight. I felt her gaze on my back when I worked in the yard, a physical touch that vanished the moment I turned around. I was the anchor she was testing, seeing if I would hold. I thought I could maintain the wall forever. I thought my professionalism was armor enough against the raw want radiating from her yard. But walls are static, and desire is fluid. The polite distance began to erode with a single shared bottle of wine that neither of us really wanted, but both of us desperately needed. The shift happened when the sun went down. Daylight was for maintaining appearances, trimming hedges, coordinating with landscapers, and waving at the mail carrier. But twilight offered a different kind of permission. The texts started arriving around 8 o'clock, brief and seeking. "David's working late again," she would type, or "I opened a bottle of Cabernet I can't finish alone." It was always a justification, a flimsy excuse to cross the property line that separated her perfect life from my quiet one. I'd find her waiting on my patio, not hers. My space was simpler, less cluttered with the expectations of her marriage and the debris of a family that demanded her constant performance. She treated my backyard like a sanctuary, a neutral ground where she could unzip the suffocating costume of the happy housewife. She was drawn to the silence I cultivated. In her house, silence was an accusation. In mine, it was just peace. She would curl her legs under her on my outdoor sofa, the linen of her trousers pulling tight against her thighs, and talk. At first, it was just noise. Complaints about the homeowners association, the endless charity galas, the hollow exhaustion of maintaining perfection. But I listened. I offered the kind of attention her husband clearly rationed like water in a drought. I became the steady anchor in her chaos, the one person who didn't need anything from her. And she leaned into that stability with a hunger that was becoming impossible to ignore. The humidity of the creeping summer night made everything feel closer, stickier, the boundaries between our bodies less defined than they were in the crisp light of day. The conversation inevitably drifted to the gaps in her life. She spoke of her husband, not with malice, but with a terrifying indifference. "He looks right through me," she said one evening, swirling the dark liquid in her glass. "I could be a piece of furniture, a lamp he bought 10 years ago and forgot he owns." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine for a reaction. I didn't give her pity. I gave her precision. "You aren't invisible, Mara," I told her, my voice low and even. "You just aren't being seen by the right audience." Her breath hitched, a tiny, sharp sound in the quiet night. It was the subtext rising to the surface, the acknowledgement that I saw her in high definition, while he saw a blur. The physical boundaries began to blur alongside the emotional ones. She stopped sitting on the opposite chair. She moved to the other end of the sofa, then the middle. She was testing the magnetic field, seeing how close she could get before the polarity reversed. I watched her track my movements. When I stood to refill our glasses or adjust the patio heater, her gaze followed my hands, my shoulders. It wasn't the polite observation of a neighbor. It was a study of a woman trying to decipher a language she hadn't spoken in years. She was vibrating with restless energy, a frequency I could feel on my own skin. Then came the moment the abstract tension became tactile. It was a Tuesday, humid and still. I was pouring her a second glass, standing over her. She reached up to take the stem, but her coordination faltered. Her fingers didn't just graze mine. They wrapped over my hand, warm and slightly damp from the condensation. It wasn't a brush. It was a grip. For 3 seconds, neither of us moved. The contact was electric, a sudden grounding of a live wire. I felt the pulse in her wrist against my thumb, rapid and erratic. She wore a silk blouse that night, the top button undone, revealing the hollow of her throat where her pulse hammered a visible rhythm. She didn't pull away. She looked up at me, her pupils blown wide in the dim porch light, terrified and thrilled. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull back. I let the moment stretch, holding the glass in her hand, letting the weight of the silence settle on us. I needed her to feel the reality of it, the heat that had nothing to do with the summer weather. She was the one who broke the circuit, jerking her hand back as if burned, spilling a drop of red wine on the limestone pavers. "Sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Clumsy." But we both knew it wasn't clumsiness. It was the first tangible proof that the safety of the fence line was gone. The tension coiled tight around us, waiting for a catalyst to snap the last of her restraint. The heat wave broke 2 weeks later, leaving the neighborhood stewing in a thick, oppressive humidity that made clothes stick to skin and turned the air into something you had to wade through. It was the kind of weather that strips away patience and pretense. David was in Chicago for a conference, leaving Mara alone in that sprawling, climate-controlled mausoleum she called a home. But she didn't stay there. She found her way to my back porch around 10 o'clock, a bottle of amber bourbon in her hand instead of her usual wine. The crickets were screaming in the trees, a frantic, rhythmic wall of sound that enclosed us in a private world. We sat in the dark, the only light coming from the citronella candles flickering on the low table between us. The shadows played tricks on her face, hollowing out her cheeks and making her eyes look like deep, dark pools. She was restless, her leg bouncing a rapid, nervous rhythm that shook the ice in her glass. We weren't talking about the homeowners association anymore. The conversation had drifted into dangerous waters, steered there by her, not me. She wanted to know about the woman in the black and white photograph in my hallway, an old love, a relationship that had defined my 30s. Usually, I sanitize these stories for the suburban crowd. I edit out the intensity, the raw edges, making it palatable for women whose biggest romantic conflict is who forgot to empty the dishwasher. But tonight, the air was too heavy for lies. I told her the truth. I spoke about the intuitive connection, the way a woman knows your body because she inhabits the same geography. I described the lack of translation needed, the silence that wasn't empty but full of understanding. I spoke of the softness that isn't weak but yielding, and the strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Mara listened with a terrifying intensity. She wasn't just being polite, she was studying. She sat forward, her elbows on her knees, the bourbon glass forgotten in her hands. She was drinking in the information like a woman who had been wandering a desert for a decade. I watched her watching me. I saw the way her gaze dropped to my mouth when I spoke about intimacy, then snapped back up to my eyes, guilty and hungry. She was measuring her life against my words and finding her own existence wanting. It was a dismantling of her reality, brick by brick, done with nothing but stories of a life she had never touched. The pacing of the night slowed down, the air thickening until it felt charged, vibrating with the things we weren't saying. She took a long, unladylike swallow of the bourbon, the liquid courage hitting her system. She set the glass down on the table with a sharp clink that sounded like a gunshot in the heavy quiet. She didn't look at me immediately. She looked at her hands, turning them over, examining the palms as if reading her own lifeline. Then she looked up, and the mask was gone entirely. Her face was open, raw, stripped of the composed elegance she wore like armor. What do women taste like? The question hung there, suspended in the humid air between us. It wasn't a joke. There was no giggling, no alcohol-fueled slur intended to diffuse the tension. It was whispered, with a desperate, terrifying vulnerability. It was a question from a woman who had spent her life eating cardboard and just realized there was a banquet in the room next door. My heart slammed against my ribs, a sudden, violent thud of adrenaline. This was the red line. This was the moment the dynamic shifted from neighborly confidant to something reckless and irrevocable. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the terror behind the curiosity. She wasn't asking for a biology lesson. She was asking for permission to want something she couldn't name. The danger of it spiked in my blood, a sharp metallic taste. I knew with absolute precision that answering this question would destroy the carefully maintained architecture of our distance. The silence that followed was heavy, a wall built of glass and expectation, waiting for me to either shatter it or reinforce it. She didn't wait for an answer. The weight of her own question seemed to crush the air out of her lungs the moment it landed. I saw the panic flare in her eyes, a sudden, sober realization of just how far she had stepped over the line. She stood up abruptly, the wicker chair scraping violently against the stone patio, a harsh sound that shattered the intimacy we had built in the dark. "I should go," she stammered, her voice tight and unrecognizable. "David calls in the morning. I need to sleep." She didn't look at me. She grabbed the bottle of bourbon but left her glass, a fingerprint-smudged monument to her lapse in judgment. I watched her retreat across the lawn, her figure swallowed by the shadows of the hedge, the back door sliding shut with a decisive, final click. The lock engaged a second later. The next morning, the sunlight was unforgiving. It exposed everything. The empty glass on my table, the footprints in the dew, and the stark reality of the fence standing between us. Mara was out there early, armored in oversized sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, attacking her rose bushes with a pair of shears. It wasn't gardening. It was penance. She was pruning with a vicious intensity, severing stems and stripping thorns, as if she could cut away the memory of the night before, along with the deadheads. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching her performance of normalcy. She knew I was there. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she deliberately refused to turn her head 5 degrees to the left. But she committed to the charade. I didn't go outside. I didn't offer her the mercy of a casual wave or a comment about the heat. I am not in the business of easing someone's conscience when they are actively lying to themselves. I stayed behind the glass, an observer in the wings, letting her feel the weight of my gaze. The silence between our houses shifted from companionable to heavy, a suffocating blanket of denial. She was rebuilding the architecture of distance, brick by panicked brick, trying to convince herself that the woman who whispered in the dark didn't exist. But I knew she did, and I knew she was starving. By the weekend, her denial had metastasized into a full-blown production. David returned on Friday, and Saturday brought the dinner party, a loud, desperate assertion of her perfect suburban existence. Cars lined the street, blocking my driveway. Shiny luxury SUVs that announced the arrival of people who talked about golf handicaps and kitchen renovations. From my darkened patio, I became the unwilling audience to her overcorrection. The noise drifted over the fence, the clinking of expensive silverware, the drone of safe conversation, and above it all, Mara's laughter. It was a brittle sound, high and jagged, like crystal tapped too hard against a countertop. It was the sound of a woman trying to drown out her own thoughts. I moved to the edge of the fence, hidden by the shadows of my oak tree, and looked through the gaps in the slats. The scene was lit like a stage play. The sliding glass doors were open, spilling golden light onto her deck. Mara was everywhere at once, refilling wine glasses before they were empty, touching David's arm with a possessive, performative affection, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. She was vibrating with a frantic energy, a hummingbird trapped in a room full of cats. To anyone else, she looked like the consummate hostess, the happy wife in her element. But I saw the cracks. I saw the way her hand trembled when she set down a platter. I saw the way her smile dropped the second she turned away from her guests, her face falling into a mask of exhausted despair before she plastered the grin back on to face the room. She was performing happiness with such aggressive precision that it looked painful. She was drinking too much, her movements becoming slightly loose, the edges of her control fraying as the night wore on. Then, for a heartbeat, the performance faltered. She stepped out onto the deck for air, away from the lights. She looked toward my house. The house was dark, but I was standing there, a cigarette I don't usually smoke, burning a small orange hole in the night. She couldn't see me, not really, but she sensed the presence. She froze, her hand gripping the railing, her chest heaving. For 10 seconds, the music and the chatter faded, and it was just us again, connected by the invisible thread of her unanswered question. She looked terrified, not of me, but of the fact that even with a house full of people and a husband at her side, she was still looking for me in the dark. She turned back to the party, fleeing the silence, but the sky was already turning a bruised purple in the west. The air was heavy, static, clinging to skin. The humidity was building again, thicker than before. She could run back to the safety of the light, but nature has a way of forcing the truth to the surface, and the storm was already on the horizon. The storm arrived like a debt being collected. Lightning split the sky open at 11:47 p.m., and the power grid surrendered immediately. My house went dark first, then hers. I was standing at my kitchen window when I saw her silhouette appear in the upstairs window of her bedroom, backlit by the brief flash of her phone's flashlight. She stood there for 30 seconds, a statue in a frame, then disappeared. 5 minutes later, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Mara standing on my porch in a thin cotton dress and no shoes, her hair wild from sleep. The rain had already soaked through the fabric, making it cling to her shoulders. She was holding her phone like a talisman. "The generator won't start," she said, her voice stripped of its usual polish. "David's flight is grounded. I'm alone over there." She didn't ask to come in. She just stepped forward and I moved aside, letting the storm push her across my threshold. The candles were already lit. I'm a woman who prepares for crisis. I led her into the living room where the fireplace cast the only light, a low, dancing glow that turned the familiar space into something foreign and intimate. The storm had stripped away the modern distractions. No Wi-Fi, no television, no phone service. Just the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the rain hammering against the windows like it wanted in. Mara stood in the center of the room, looking small and exposed without the armor of her perfect clothes and perfect composure. She hugged herself, shivering slightly, and I realized I was seeing her without the performance for the first time. "You're staring," she said. But there was no accusation in it, just a statement of fact. "You're different without the fence between us." She laughed, a short, brittle sound. The fence was always a lie. I poured her a glass of whiskey. Neat. No ice, no pretense. She took it with both hands, like she needed the warmth. We sat on the floor in front of the fire, not the sofa. The distance between us was measured in inches now, not property lines. The conversation started safe. The storm, the damage it might cause, the inconvenience. But the subtext was screaming. Every time she shifted, her dress moved against her skin, and I could see the goosebumps on her arms. She wasn't cold. She was terrified. The whiskey loosened something in her. She started talking about the dinner party, about how she'd stood at her kitchen sink at 2 a.m. afterward, scrubbing dishes that were already clean, trying to wash away the memory of her own voice asking that question. "I could feel you watching me," she whispered, staring into the fire. "Even with all those people there, I was performing for an audience of one." "You didn't ask because you were curious," I said, and my voice was softer than I intended. "You asked because you're starving." She turned to look at me then, and the mask was gone entirely. Her face was open, raw, stripped of the composed elegance she wore like armor. Her eyes were wet, not from crying, but from the effort of holding back. "I don't know how to want something I was never supposed to want," she said. And the words came out broken, like they were tearing her throat on the way up. "I don't know how to be this person." "You're not a different person," I told her. "You're just finally letting yourself be the one you've been all along." The denial cracked then, not with a whimper, but with a sound like ice breaking on a lake. She made a noise in her chest, something between a sob and a gasp, and her hands started shaking so badly she had to set the glass down. She looked at her fingers like they belonged to someone else, like she couldn't believe they were capable of wanting what they wanted. The social armor she'd spent years polishing fell away in pieces, clattering to the floor like discarded costume jewelry. Underneath was just skin, just need, just the raw, terrifying truth of a woman who had finally admitted she was dying of thirst. The space between us collapsed, the final barrier between polite neighbors and something far more dangerous, crumbling in an instant. Not gradually, but all at once, like a structure whose foundation has been quietly undermined for years and finally gives way under its own weight. Mara moved first. She didn't ask permission. She closed the distance between us on the floor in front of the fire, her hand finding mine with a certainty that contradicted the tremor in her fingers. The rain outside had become a wall of sound, a relentless drumming against the windows that sealed us in this moment, making the world outside irrelevant. Her palm was damp against mine, not from the rain, but from the effort of holding back. I felt her pulse hammering against my thumb, a frantic rhythm that matched my own. I let her lead, for exactly 3 seconds, giving her the illusion of control before I claimed what I knew we both needed. Then I took control. This was my territory. Intimacy, vulnerability, the dangerous terrain of crossing lines you can never uncross. I turned my hand in hers, interlacing our fingers with a deliberate slowness that made her breath catch. My other hand came up to her face, fingers tracing the line of her jaw, with a precision that was half tenderness, half command. Her skin was hot under my touch, feverish. The firelight caught the sheen of sweat at her temple, the glow making her look like something illuminated from within. She didn't flinch. Her breath hitched softly, a sound of surrender. Instead, she leaned into the contact with a soft exhale that seemed to release months of tension, her eyes fluttering shut, and I saw the exact moment she surrendered to the architecture of her own desire. The first kiss was not an explosion. It was a homecoming, slow and inevitable as dawn, a return to something we both recognized. I tasted bourbon and rain and the salt of tears she hadn't let fall. Her mouth was hesitant at first, uncertain, the way someone's is when they're reading a language they understand but have never spoken aloud. I guided her with patience that felt like a luxury, a slow exploration that gave her permission to be clumsy, to be unsure, to be exactly where she was. My tongue traced her lower lip, a question she answered by opening to me, a soft sigh escaping her that sounded like relief. The air between us thickened, charged with the permission she finally gave herself. She tasted of repression and release, of conformity and rebellion, of silence and first words. She tasted of years spent building a life that fit someone else's blueprint, and the sudden, terrifying freedom of tearing up the plans and starting over. Her hands found my waist, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. Her fingers pressed into my skin through the thin fabric of my shirt, learning the topography of a body that was both familiar and utterly foreign to her. The rain had become a symphony outside, a crescendo that matched the rising intensity between us. I felt her shiver, not from cold, but from the sheer voltage of finally touching what she'd only allowed herself to look at. My hand moved to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, deeper into the kiss, and she came willingly, hungrily, her straight assumptions dissolving like sugar in hot water, leaving nothing but the clear, sweet truth beneath. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she didn't pull away. She stayed close, her forehead pressed against mine, her eyes still closed. "I didn't know," she whispered, the words ragged. "I didn't know it could feel like this. I thought I understood what I wanted, but I had no idea. The reality was so much more." Her vulnerability was a physical thing, a weight pressing against my chest. I could feel the exact moment her denial shattered completely, leaving only the raw need beneath. The storm outside had become a metaphor made manifest, nature forcing the truth to the surface with the same relentless pressure that had been building between us for months, washing away all the lies we'd told ourselves. I kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. Her hands moved to my face, holding me with a reverence that made my heart ache. The rain poured down, a cleansing, relentless force, and we were lost in the precision of touch, the mapping of a new geography written on each other's skin. The fence between our houses still stood, silent witness to our transformation. But the gate had been kicked open, and there was no going back to the way things were before tonight. The kiss deepened, and I guided her past the threshold of curiosity into the territory of pure need. My hands moved to the hem of her soaked dress, fingers finding the damp cotton and lifting it over her head in one fluid motion. She didn't resist. The fabric fell away, and she sat before me in the firelight, exposed not just in skin, but in intention. Her body was a map of contradictions. Tan lines from summers spent maintaining the perfect suburban image, a small scar on her ribs she would later confess came from a childhood she barely remembered. I traced these landmarks with my mouth, answering her question not with words, but with precision. Taste is not a single note. It is a composition. I started at her collarbone, where her perfume lingered, mixing with the rain and the whiskey. The skin there was salty from sweat and tears she hadn't let fall. I moved lower, and she sighed, a sound that was part surrender, part discovery. Her hands found my hair, not guiding, just holding on as the ground shifted beneath her. The storm outside had become a rhythm for us, the thunder marking time as my mouth mapped her body. She tasted of fear and relief, of years spent building a life that fit someone else's blueprint, and the sudden, terrifying freedom of tearing up the plans. She tasted of the wine she drank to tolerate dinner parties, and the coffee she used to wake up to a performance she no longer believed in. I took my time. This was not a race to a finish line, but a lesson in a language she had never spoken aloud. I showed her the difference between being touched and being understood. When my mouth found her breast, she gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like shock. Her nipple hardened against my tongue, and I felt the moment her brain tried to categorize the sensation against a lifetime of heterosexual benchmarks and found no match. "This is different," she whispered, not a question, a realization. "Everything is different." I didn't answer. I just kept showing her, my hands steady on her hips, my mouth deliberate. The air in the room had become a third presence, thick with humidity and the scent of rain-soaked earth seeping through the window frames. She was trembling, not from cold, but from the sheer voltage of finally being touched the way her body had always craved, but her mind had refused to acknowledge. When I moved lower, she tensed, her thighs pressing together in a final, instinctive act of self-preservation. Wait, she breathed. I don't know if I can... I paused, my lips against her stomach, feeling the flutter of her muscles under the skin. You can, I murmured, the words vibrating against her. You already are. She exhaled, a long, shuddering release, and her legs parted. The trust in that movement was profound, a gift I accepted with reverence. The taste of her was the answer to her question, but it was also more than that. It was the taste of a woman who had spent her life being polite and was now, finally, gloriously selfish. It was the taste of a wife who had stopped performing and started wanting. It was the taste of a neighbor who had crossed every boundary and found herself exactly where she needed to be. She was salty and sweet, familiar and foreign, a contradiction that made perfect sense the moment my tongue found her center. Her hands gripped the rug beneath us, knuckles white, as the sensation overwhelmed her. The moan that escaped her was raw, unfiltered, nothing like the controlled laughter she used at parties. This was the sound of a woman who had forgotten there was an audience and was simply, finally, feeling. The storm outside reached its peak, lightning illuminating the room in brief, shocking flashes that revealed her face twisted in a mixture of pleasure and terror. She was unraveling, thread by thread, and I was the instrument of her undoing. When she came, it was with a cry that was swallowed by the thunder, her body arching off the floor like a bow pulled to its breaking point. I held her through it, my mouth gentle, my hands anchoring her hips to the earth. The release was seismic, a fault line shifting deep underground, changing the topography of who she thought she was. After, she lay still, her chest heaving, her eyes closed. I moved back up her body, finding her mouth with mine, letting her taste herself on my lips. It was the final answer to her question, the most intimate form of proof. She kissed me back with a hunger that was different now, no longer curious, but certain. The storm outside began to ease, the rain slowing to a steady patter, the wind dropping from a howl to a whisper. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting us in amber and shadow. She curled into my side, her head on my chest, and we lay in the quiet that follows a revelation. The question, what do women taste like, had been answered, but the answer had opened 1,000 more questions she would spend months learning to ask. The storm had passed, but the internal landscape was irrevocably changed. The morning arrived with a cruel clarity, sunlight slicing through the blinds like a blade on fresh snow. I woke alone, the space beside me still warm, where Mara had curled until dawn. She'd slipped back across the lawn before first light, her bare feet leaving prints in the wet grass that the rising sun would erase. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee mug warm in my hands, watching her house stir to life. David's car pulled into the driveway at 7:30, his suitcase thudding against the asphalt. He walked into their home like a man returning from a business trip, unaware that the architecture of his marriage had been fundamentally redesigned while he was gone. Mara emerged an hour later, wearing sunglasses and a white linen dress that buttoned to her throat. She moved through her garden with a deliberate slowness, touching the hydrangeas without seeing them. The fear radiating off her was different now, not the hot panic of shame, but the cold, calculated dread of logistics. She wasn't worried about what she'd done. She was worried about how to hide it. I watched her track my window, her head turning a fraction before she forced it back to her roses. The fence between our properties had never looked more like a cage. I went outside when she was at the far end of her yard, pulling weeds with a mechanical precision. She heard my gate click and stiffened, but didn't turn. I leaned against the fence post, casual, giving her the option to pretend I wasn't there. She chose to face me. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but her mouth was a tight line of control. "David's home," she said, not a question. A statement of fact that hung between us like a threat. "He doesn't know," I replied, keeping my voice low and even. "He won't know from me." She pulled off the sunglasses then, and her eyes were red-rimmed. Not from crying, but from exhaustion. "That's not what I'm afraid of," she whispered. "I'm afraid he won't notice. I'm afraid I can look him in the eye and lie, and he'll believe me, because he's never really looked at me at all." The confession landed like a stone in still water. This was the shift, from shame, to a deeper, more dangerous truth. She wasn't scared of being caught. She was scared of getting away with it, of living a double life that felt more real than the one she'd built. I held her gaze, refusing to let her spiral into regret. "You didn't ask because you were curious," I said, repeating the words from last night. "You asked because you're starving. That's not something you can unlearn." Her fingers tightened on the garden shears. "What do I do with that knowledge? How do I go to the grocery store? How do I host the next neighborhood potluck, knowing that every smile I give him is a performance?" "You build a new structure around it," I told her. "You can't undo the knowledge, Mara, but you can decide what to do with it." She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the precise moment her denial shattered completely. "It wasn't a phase," she said, her voice steady now, stripped of its earlier tremor. "It wasn't wine and storm and proximity. It was a fundamental piece of myself I didn't know existed until your mouth was on mine. I can't go back to being the woman who didn't know what she was missing. That woman is gone." The fence line felt electric, charged with the impossibility of returning to polite waves and discussions about lawn care. David called her name from their back door, his voice carrying across the lawn with casual ownership. She didn't flinch, but her eyes flickered with something I couldn't name. "I'll be right there," she called back, the performance already clicking into place. She turned to me one last time before walking away. "The gate stays unlocked," she said, so quietly I almost missed it. "On my side, just so you know." Then she was gone, back to her husband and her hydrangeas and the life that fit like a dress she'd outgrown. The fence remained, but the gate between us was open now, a secret passage through the carefully maintained architecture of our distance. We couldn't undo the knowledge, so we had to build a new structure around it, one that allowed for stolen glances, for fingertips brushing when we passed platters at block parties, for the charged silence that would forever hum between our houses. The suburban landscape looked the same, but the geometry had shifted. The question had been answered, and in answering it, we'd drawn a new map entirely. The days that followed settled into a pattern that looked like normalcy, but felt like a live wire hidden beneath the surface. We resumed our roles as polite neighbors, but the performance now had a shared secret, humming underneath every interaction. At the block party 3 weeks later, Mara handed me a plate of deviled eggs, and her fingers brushed mine for exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary. The contact was brief, but the current between us was enough to make my pulse jump. She didn't look at me when it happened, but I saw the small, secret smile she hid behind her wine glass. This became our new language: stolen moments, charged silences, and the electric space between our bodies when we stood too close at the mailbox. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a complex, adult arrangement built on the ruins of her denial and my refusal to pretend nothing had changed. Mara's transformation wasn't dramatic. It was a slow erosion of the mask she'd worn so long that it had become her face. She stopped twisting her wedding ring. She started wearing her hair down, the severe ponytail abandoned for a loose, casual style that made her look younger and less contained. I watched her from my window as she moved through her garden with a different kind of attention, touching the flowers like she was finally allowing herself to feel something other than obligation. The neighbor who had once been a 2-dimensional figure in a perfect house became a 3-dimensional woman, complex and contradictory and real. She was still married, she still hosted dinner parties, but now, when she laughed at her husband's jokes, the sound had a hollow quality, and I could see the effort it took to maintain the illusion. The geometry of our neighborhood had shifted. The fence remained, but the gate between our properties became a portal to a secret world. She started leaving it unlocked, the latch slightly ajar, as a signal. Sometimes I'd find small offerings on my porch: a single, perfect rose, a jar of homemade jam, a note scrawled on the back of a receipt that said nothing and everything. I reciprocated in kind, leaving a book of poetry, a candle that smelled like the storm that had changed everything, a key to my back door tucked under her doormat. We communicated in objects and glances, building a vocabulary that didn't require words. The other neighbors saw what they wanted to see: 2 women who had become close friends, sharing recipes and gardening tips. They missed the way Mara's gaze lingered on my mouth when I spoke, the way I angled my body toward hers when we stood together, the way the air between us thickened with what we weren't saying. Mara accepted her complexity, but acceptance didn't mean simplicity. She still had days where the weight of her double life felt like drowning. She'd appear at my door after dark, not for passion, but for the steadying presence of someone who understood the cost of the truth she was living. We'd sit on my patio in silence, her head on my shoulder, and I'd feel the tension drain from her body as she allowed herself to simply exist without performing. The narrator's reflection on proximity became our shared meditation. How little we know those closest to us, how the person next door can be a universe of hidden desires, how the most intimate relationships can be built on the smallest breaches in the architecture of distance. The question, what do women taste like, had been answered, but the answer had opened 1,000 more questions about identity, loyalty, and the price of authenticity. The fence remained, but the gate between us stayed unlocked, a permanent invitation to cross the boundary whenever the need became too great to ignore. We built a new structure around the knowledge, one that allowed for stolen kisses behind the garage during holiday parties, for fingertips brushing when we passed platters, for the charged silence that would forever hum between our houses. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was ours, a secret world built within the confines of the neighborhood, a geometry of desire that only we could map. The question had been answered not with words, but with the shared reality of our bodies, our secrets, and the undeniable pull that had rewritten the physics of the entire cul-de-sac. Mara was the neighbor who became a lover, the question that opened a door I couldn't close. The final image is us, standing on our respective sides of the property line at dusk, connected by the invisible thread of a secret that has rewired the entire neighborhood. If you understand the pull of a question you can't take back, subscribe for more stories from the edge.